I do want to give Robert a proper introduction to the Porkbelly podcast. I know we've been texting kind of back and forth about a year and a half since I first got to know people in the LaRouche Institute. Robert is someone who the depth of his thought has really impressed me, especially with his recent article, Ecostology and the New World Order. And Robert, you successfully tied together a lot of what is happening in the news, um, with Peter Thiel saying that he loves the Antichrist or wants to be the Antichrist or something, with the past 100 years and more of cultural and religious development, and going even further back with LaRouche discussing the Renaissance origins of what we're seeing right now. Really, it's really a good synopsis of the modern condition in one article. Like first off, how long did you, I guess, take to write that?
Um, the process of writing that essay, I kind of moved away from working with the LaRouche organization. I don't know. It took me about a month. Yeah, not in like it wasn't like there was no bad blood or anything, but I just kind of, my thinking really changed throughout the process of writing this essay. It means like an attempt, right? So it was an attempt to clarify my own thought. And in the process of doing it, I changed my thinking a lot.
That's really
my thinking
interesting. We're still getting a little bit of lag. Looks like it's from Robert's end. But I'm also gonna check my computer. Bobby, do you have any suggestions?
If he's on his phone, is he on a Wi-Fi connection or is he using cellular data?
Robert, which type of connection are you using?
He's reconnecting.
All right. Which one would be better for him to use?
Whichever one he isn't using right now.
Okay.
We lost him. Let's see if we can get him back.
We'll get him back on.
He's reconnecting still.
I'll text him in the chat.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Oh yeah.
Hopefully this. Is that better?
Yeah,
yeah, that's looking a lot better.
Okay. Well, yeah, for some reason my phone wasn't on the Wi-Fi, so.
Oh, okay.
I think I'm on the Wi-Fi now, so hopefully it doesn't change.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. My suggestion was just that you might need to get off the Wi-Fi and just use a cellular connection. But so I just suggested the exact opposite of what seems to be working.
Yeah,
I just said use the opposite of whatever you're using now.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Robert, you were telling us about how writing this article actually changed your viewpoints, which I guess I wouldn't have expected that. I mean, of course, Seraphim Rose's viewpoint is different than LaRouche's viewpoint, but tell us more about that.
Well, it's kind of the substance of this whole long article in a way, but basically the shortest way of putting it is, there's a religious idea of last days, right?
Yeah.
What the word eschatology comes from is the biblical Greek eschaton or eschatos, which is just a Greek word that basically means last. It shows up all throughout the scriptures in different contexts. Obviously, in the prophetic context, like a revelation, like the last days, but it can mean like least, like in the Beatitudes, or like when Jesus says, like the least among them.
Mm-hmm.
That's also eschatos. But that this kind of there are many different religious eschatologies, right? That Jews have. There's various sects of Judaism which each have distinct eschatologies. Obviously, Christian Zionism, for example, is a kind of, I think,
true,
the obvious kind of heretical blasphemous eschatology. So anyway, I had always my interest in working with the LaRouche organization was, I was watching this war in Ukraine sort of spiraling out of control for about a year, just watching podcasts and stuff and feeling like it was crazy to just sort of sit around and watch these things get worse and worse. I actually should do something about it. And then there's a whole interesting story of how I actually sort of came to be intellectually engaged with LaRouche's writings and decide that I actually wanted to work with his organization. But yeah, it was definitely a concern for the fate of the world, that kind of drew me into working with the LaRouche organization. But they don't have they have a very, I would say, secular kind of concept of history.
Yeah, as you've written about, I recall that for LaRouche, science itself is sort of a Prometheus moment, and all the scientific discoveries are like a Prometheus moment, which frees humanity from the past. And I can see why that view would be at tension with, say, for example, like Seraphim Rose's eschatology. Is that sort of it?
Yeah. And LaRouche is interesting because as I get into in the essay, like he's not a materialist. His focus on science is about sort of reviving a very specific kind of anti-materialist strain of scientific thought. So he's like Orthodox Christianity and a lot of other more traditional forms of thinking. He's a very powerful opponent of these extreme kind of nihilistic materialists that are now sort of masquerading under the guise of science, scientism.
Yeah. One point that really stuck out was the quote you chose to show that science, although it appears at first like a liberating force, but scientism, like taking over as the guiding principle of society, is actually um like more oppressive than what it replaces, because it reduces everything to only sense data. And in this absence of like a higher principle, um we get a sort of breakdown. I think this would the Russians would actually agree with this, that there's a breakdown of what it means to be human. Like when I talked with Jose Vega, that's what he told me, is that we've forgotten what it means to be human. But for like Larouchians, they really are Neoplatonists. So they view going back to the sort of creative principle, even if it's a secularized creative principle, but it's kind of like this Neoplatonic creative principle, that this will somehow like restore humans to their um the correct teleology, like the correct human path of development. And yeah, I don't know. It is like a really like secular worldview, but with a religious type of teleology. Like they're so certain that somehow having the right philosophy, or like having this creative principle being respected, will restore human society to what it'll be. And that always made me a little bit skeptical of arguments I heard from the LaRouche organization.
Now, with first off, I would like to say that I feel a lot of people don't truly realize how much religion has to do with human history, as well as how much it tends to be involved with politics nowadays. Because even though, especially in the U.S., where government's separate from state, if that's the case, then why are most politicians and most political groups part of similar, if not the exact same, religious groups? Now, in terms of the path that the humans went down, I do believe that we did take a turn at some point, and I believe it was around the early 1900s. Basically, around the time that they started having processed foods, the major industrialization of America, well, not just America, but industrialization of first world countries such as that. I do believe that we took a turn down the wrong direction, because there's even been evidence where it took a single generation after the development of processed foods before the human race started evolving with smaller mouths. They didn't require such big open mouths to be hunter gatherers and do what they needed with the food that they could get. So once they started having processed food, you can even see where human mouths shrank. That's the reason that we have to have our wisdom teeth removed now. Is because before, our mouths were big enough and wide enough, it could fit all of the teeth. Now, after processed foods were introduced, took one generation, mouths started shrinking, and now we can't have wisdom. We can't allow wisdom teeth in our mouths anymore, because from the evolution, it would end up prohibiting us, or another word for basically, it would end up being painful or hurtful to us as human beings to survive with them.
And yet the world's full of big mouths.
Well, yeah, that don't mean that people don't stop talking.
Well, I still want to ask Robert a question. Like, if I guess if you still see the Larouchian, like teleology and like their faith in human progress is something that's tenable, is something, or with you saying that that's too secular, is that kind of what you're talking about? Is that by having so much faith in science, that it leads us to an unrealistic expectation?
I think for myself, as I try to ask these questions, I mean, these are enormous questions, right? And they really are world historical questions, and so in a sense, I think it is. In a sense, I do think it's somewhat vain to speculate about it, and I think that's part of where I kind of got to a point where insisting in a sort of proselytizing an idea of secular progress. It's not that the reason why that became untenable for me wasn't because I don't believe in the possibility of human progress at all, or that I think that all science and all progress is just doomed and evil, so much as that I think that the future is a much more mysterious horizon than something that we can just sort of know through our reason.
Yeah.
So
was there like times when you debated this with people in the organization, or did you just sort of does that philosophical disagreement turn you off from still participating in their political interventions?
I mean, to be honest, just in my own sort of the state of my own personal life, living through this political calamity that our country is going through, it's just sort of a matter of priority. I mean, I love Jose Vega. I love everyone in the LaRouche organization. They're extremely good people. They're extremely moral people. They're very creative. They're very philosophically inclined. They have, for a long time, they have kept alive this idea of a kind of Platonic humanist academy that they just sort of run of their own volition, and that's all good. That's all well and good in my view. So it's more so a matter of priority for my humble life, how much time I have and what's like that.
Yeah. Would you say you're more interested in religious questions now? Because I know you've been talking to me about how you're now very interested in the teachings of Seraphim Rose and Orthodoxy.
Yeah, I mean, I had a friend who had converted to Orthodoxy in 2020, and he had been basically telling me every couple months for the last 5 years that I should go at least check out a service or something. And I have sort of since learned that there's a sort of internet phenomenon of Orthodox people that are sort of, I guess, like somewhat infamous in certain respects and stuff. So it's kind of a funny thing to have stumbled into this, because I go talk to a priest or something, and they're like, "Oh, you found out about Orthodoxy through the internet, and you're reading Seraphim Rose." Like, okay, like
that makes it almost embarrassing, because that's basically who I am as well. I converted.
Yeah. I think that with the Charlie Kirk assassination, it was interesting because Charlie Kirk was assassinated on September 10th, right?
Right.
And I was just finishing that essay that I wrote on September 10th, and actually it came across my screen as I was hitting send on to publish the essay. And I think it's pretty and there's sort of an irony, because in my essay, I attacked Tucker Carlson because he's talking about, because of the manner in which he talks about things like demons.
Is there really demons? Like, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, it's not even so much that he raises the question, but it's the way that he asserts it with such almost quasi-religious certainty, but on the other hand doesn't take the question seriously, in the sense that he's not actually really discussing what that would mean.
It's like his episodes are more about like, this individual occultist influenced this person, or like, this individual occultist was in this rock band, and it doesn't go into like a deep philosophical autopsy like you did of how these ideas actually relate to each other.
Yeah, and if you're actually going to espouse a belief in demons as opposed to another explanation for certain things in the world, that actually does have epistemological ramifications for everything that you think and everything that you say, because you actually do hold this. Because I think at least my limited understanding, is that if you're going to actually espouse a kind of Orthodox Christian dogmatic view of demons, the only way that you can really do that without just appealing, you can just say anything, but if you're gonna do that and have consistency with your thought, basically, I think what you're doing is you look at the Orthodox catechism, which I've been reading. There's essentially two sources of truth for this Christian worldview. It's the Holy Scripture and the Holy Tradition, right? And the Holy Tradition of the writing of the Church Fathers over the last 2,000 years, that's the source of all of this kind of dogmatic demonology, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to espouse a belief in demons, and if you actually think that is the thing that is sort of driving a lot of these things, if you just say, "Oh yeah, I believe in demons," but you don't make any reference whatsoever to any of this Christian tradition, then it's, what are you? Are you just... Because of course,
he's making it nebulous. I didn't think of that. I previously didn't think of that, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, and the Nazis were traditionalists. Lots of people are traditionalists. You can make a syncretic ideology out of religion.
Well, for all the times I've heard Tucker talk about his religious faith, I remember previously in the 2020 era, he was like, "Well, I'm surprised I'm still religious." It's sort of like, I think he thinks of himself as a man who's very much of this world, about this world. So it could totally be that he's just bringing on these occultists and people who study occultism just to get the views. I still think it's a good thing that that especially the one on occults, Kabbalah, and AI, that video was published, because it goes into so much of what of how AI, how we view AI right now, is actually becoming very similar to how occultists viewed their summoning systems, their sigil systems, where it's this sort of spirit that we summon on demand for our will, and AI can become it is becoming the ultimate tool of manipulation. I think in a few years, we're going to get to an internet where we don't really know what on the internet is real, what is AI generated. And because of that, it's just a really powerful tool to lead people astray from the spiritual perspective. The Orthodox group chat I'm in, Like people are usually sending articles about AI, and the article is going to be critical of AI. Like for example, um, some of the biggest Amazon bestsellers on orthodoxy, the books, show like strong signs of being AI generated. And since AI is often used to generate visual images, like AI, you know what AI slop is, but with the Orthodox online phenomenon, some people are using AI to generate icons, like holy images. And this is extremely problematic because to you know to produce an icon is no small labor. There's a lot of spiritual requirements to be disciplined, to fast often, to be humble and live a life of prayer if you're going to produce icons. So for AI to like something with no connection to humanity to generate these images automatically on a mass scale rapidly, it it really encapsulates a way that technology is at odds with spirituality.
Now, since
Absolutely.
we're gonna go ahead and dive into AI a little bit, let me also ask you at what point, if it hasn't already happened, as some people know, the internet that anybody sees and accesses every day is only about 10% of the actual internet. And that I believe it's 90% of the internet is the dark web, as everybody would call it. So what effects do you think AI would have on the dark web? And if it doesn't have effects on the dark web, at what point is the dark web, or at what point is the percentage of internet going to be starting to be split between dark web and AI, and then we still have our normal 10%?
Is that for me?
I don't know if that's Robert's
Well,
field of expertise.
Yeah, I know Roman's knowledgeable on AI.
No, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, dude. That's like,
I do think that, I mean, there's a way to sort of tie what both of you said together, which is like, yeah. So I think in a way it's easy to assume that like all the people that are trying to manipulate us with AI are just like us. They have a laptop, right? And like they're just sending out their like like they're just using AI in the same way that we are, right? But obviously, if you think about not just like, if you don't make that false equivalence and you think about the idea of applying AI to at a kind of systems analysis level to the whole infrastructure of the internet, that's to me obviously where the true danger is. And something like what you were describing, Roman, of like you could imagine somebody who's like, you know, like historical revisionism, for example.
Yeah,
you could like people could already be like specifically going in, like just as like a hypothetical example, like all of the Orthodox literature on the internet. Like let's just start like revising this, subtly changing it.
And if you don't have the print books, then you wouldn't actually be able to double check against it.
Don't have the book, you're not in contact with the tradition, you think you're, and so then that's why I brought up the Charlie Kirk thing, right? Because I was going to respond to what you were saying about like being embarrassed, because that's also a description of yourself.
Yeah.
But obviously, so the Charlie Kirk assassination, you saw all of the theatrics and the funeral that was for him afterwards in this big stadium. Like it was obvious that one of the things that they were doing was they're driving this kind of Christian revival, right? Revival of a kind of Christian nationalism. And I'm looking at that, and it's interesting because I'm going through this kind of process of seeking a religious tradition on my own.
Yeah.
But then also watching this kind of like technologically mediated psyop culture thing happen, where like millions of people are being like provoked to ask these questions. And yeah, maybe that is a good thing. Maybe that's like that. Maybe that's like an antichrist that's trying to draw people into this movement for the purpose of deceiving them and corrupting the religion. Right. So,
I mean, unless someone's like 100% on board with MAGA at this point, which is very few people, because not even MAGA people are MAGA anymore. are pro-Trump anymore. It's it with the Charlie Kirk funeral, I think Trump does it, but he does it badly because it's so obviously political. Where it's like, okay, like if you care about Charlie Kirk's legacy, if you're a good Christian, like here, donate to Turning Point USA. Tell you what, here's some merch, and like you're literally like making it about your next election aims. What could be more nefarious is people who use AI to I guess produce art, like produce the archetypes of and produce the things that we learn from. Like if textbooks were AI generated, if like reading lists were AI generated, what would this do to us as a culture? And I think there's a really interesting connection with how Rene Girardon views human learning and basically what humans are to what AI is. Because if I remember correctly, Rene believes that humans are just mimetic creatures, that we basically just learn by observing something, recording the data, and then repeating it somehow, however our processes want it to do. And I'm reading that and I'm thinking, well, that's like the way Rene Girardon views human nature is exactly the way, well, it's exactly what AI is. Because if you say that about a human, then it's like you're saying you don't see a difference between humans and AI at that point. Um, so if we're going in a direction culturally, economically, where AI is the center of everything and the engine of everything, then I don't think that will mean people view AIs as sentient, but I actually think it's the opposite, that people will view humans as little better than biological AIs.
Yeah, I think that's sort of generally how I view it too.
Yeah.
And that is like, again, that's why, even though my thinking shifted more towards a biblical interpretation, and I'm much more interested in like studying religious texts as opposed to secular texts at this point. But LaRouche was attacking the idea of artificial intelligence in the 1950s.
Right.
So like there's a way in which his critique is so profound, because he was, as you said, like as a Neoplatonist, he was well positioned through, I think, just kind of fate to understand the trajectory of secular society in the United States as something that was downstream of this larger process of the Anglo-American establishment sort of creating this transatlantic partnership between Britain, the former world empire, British Empire, and this sort of the most powerful nation state,
New York and London, basically.
Yeah, New York and London, and so you have that kind of geopolitical scheme that he was very keyed into from an early point. But then there's a cultural analysis there's an analysis of the culture that is the result of that worldview, and that is the worldview of cybernetics. That's the cybernetic view, is that you're going to create this world system, right? I think that artificial intelligence, it's right there in like this is something that Whitney Webb often talks about, but like Henry Kissinger's book with Eric Schmidt, or not Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google. He published a book with Henry Kissinger in like 2019.
I don't know the name, but
yeah, they say like there's going to be this cognitive diminishment, and there's going to be like basically people who use AI to control other people, and then there's going to be other people that are controlled by AI, and they're going to have cognitive diminishment. And so it's going to cause this kind of stratification in the society, which is also that comports with basically the way that Peter Thiel talks about it, him and these other they talk about like centaur intelligence. I don't know if you've heard that.
I haven't heard that one.
That's like that kind of connects to Leo Strauss a little bit, I think. But basically, the people that are designing these systems, they because they have the ability to manipulate these information technologies in this way successfully, because they actually do perceive in the material world that they have this power. They believe that they are like a higher species. And so like that's what Peter Thiel. I've seen it in passing.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about Peter Thiel and his adoption of Eastern Orthodox concepts and as a way to attack the Enlightenment is something that's gotten a lot of news attention. I don't think that a lot of people would actually understand it though. And what I get from Thiel is that he views the world now as sort of a failed Enlightenment project, particularly the Enlightenment idea of equality and the idea of sort of expanding the circle of who's inside society is actually leading to a more cruel alienation, right? And he's someone who, as you wrote in your essay, actually believes that violence, and particularly this idea of sacred violence, is what actually holds society together. Can you explain that in a little more depth? Because that's one of the things that, like, I think I have an idea of what he's talking about, but I'm not totally sure.
The sacred violence thing or the Enlightenment thing, or kind of how they're
related? Yeah, both.
Yes. Well, the Enlightenment, that's a really interesting subject. I want to do more research on Tudor England and stuff, because it's a really interesting time. You know, that was like when the New World was getting colonized. You had Shakespeare, you had basically the birth of modern science, but you still had a lot of like occult and stuff that was happening
right
in England. You know, like famously Isaac Newton was like an occultist. But I think one really good kind of like something good for Americans to kind of remember and place themselves in history with regard to this whole question is the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe. Because if you actually go and look at his writings, not so much the poetry, but more his prose poems and his essays and stuff, his more satirical, historical stuff, the main person that he has this epistemological critique. He was a Neoplatonist. Okay. This is where LaRouche gets a lot of his interest in Kepler, for example.
Yeah.
Poe was very keyed into looking at Kepler as the father of modern science, not Isaac Newton, because Isaac Newton was already kind of into this mode of empiricism, whereas Kepler, if you go and look at Kepler's writings, they're very interesting. They're Platonic, and they're not merely empirical. It's not an idea of science that is reduced to this kind of empirical material data. There's a very real idealism in Kepler's approach to science, where he's using like, for example, the Platonic solids as, you know, these are like the 5 shapes that limit space regularly, right? The Platonic cube and the tetrahedron and the dodecahedron.
To reel it back in, because this is getting kind of far from the original question.
Well, let me just say.
So, go ahead.
The reason why I brought up Poe, because I know I'm rambling, but the reason why I brought up Poe is because Poe, as a Neoplatonist, he was the one person that he was attacking more than anybody else in his writings was Francis Bacon.
Okay.
And he's really explicit that Poe, as a Neoplatonist, as an American, he views this particular way of thinking about the world, this empirical form of science, to be a very evil and corrupting influence in society. And so he's attacking it as a poet, and he's attacking it as somebody who's interested in the history of science and philosophy.
Right.
And that, to me, that is a really, it's a helpful way of remembering it, because, you know, Poe was 1809 to 1849, early days of the American Republic. And at that time, Francis Bacon was sort of like a few generations back. It was like the cultural inheritance that the Americans had gotten from England in terms of what was science. And it was this kind of idea of you just strip everything down to data, and then you form these inductive generalizations. And Poe was attacking that. So the reason why I brought up Poe is just because as Americans, our own history, that's a way to kind of ground yourself in the question and look at it as a question of our own history. But the way that ties into this idea of sacred violence and Peter Thiel, I mean, that's an enormous question. But I think the basic idea is it is a question, whether you answer the question as a Neoplatonist would, and you say that there's a more kind of secular form for what differentiates human beings from animals or from machines, or if you look at it from a more traditional religious question or traditional religious viewpoint, which is obviously different. Obviously, both of those things are, Neoplatonism and Orthodox Christianity. They have a very strong critique of this idea that we are just machines, or that we are just merely animals. But I think if you believe that the human being is either a machine and or an animal, right, then that leaves you. If you're the person in control of that society, then you're basically going to view the people that are the people that subsist on the system that you control. You view them as cattle. Yeah. And you view yourself as this kind of. I think Peter Thiel, I think almost in spite of himself, kind of views his own mind. I think they think of the human mind as a machine. Yes.
Well, so that way of thinking of how humans or animals and that kind of thing, that study would essentially be going back to the Old Testament, the old Jewish Bible, where it literally states goyim, or anybody who is a non-Jew. It states that goyims are animals. Kill all goyim.
Which part of the Bible states that? We got to be precise about that.
You're probably talking. You're talking about the Torah? You're probably talking about the Talmud, right?
Talmud sounds close. Yeah.
Because the Torah is that's like the Old Testament. That's like what the Christians also read.
Yeah, I've never seen anything
like that. That's like Mosaic law, all that. Yeah. You're probably talking about the Talmud, because there's a lot of crazy shit in the Talmud.
There's a lot, because it states there's a lot of violent acts that are stated in the Talmud that they say, hey, if they're not Jewish, do it to them. Who cares?
I think the Talmud was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was it started in the 1100s, or I'm not exactly sure, but it was, it was much later, and it was just kind of, it was commentary on the Torah and these other things, and then it was commentary on the commentary, right? And that is actually the birth of Kabbalah.
Yeah.
So it is very interesting, because the Kabbalah, then it does these Kabbalah and these other forms of occultism. They are there in the Enlightenment, the so-called Enlightenment, and for someone like Francis Bacon or even Isaac Newton, they were literally practicing Kabbalah and other weird, just not non-scientific and non-Christian kind of forms of thinking of divination. And I think that a lot of that stuff is tied into the history of the development of, so-called modern science.
Well,
now, if you go and you break down the term sacred violence, that would essentially imply that the violence you commit is for the God you are worshiping. So therefore, now, given even nowadays, especially, I read your what was the Substack, was it? And you even stated where in Gaza they are committing genocide on men, women, children, everybody. I guess the question is, do you truly believe that this sacred violence is giving them their enlightenment, or is it more so that is their way of excusing themselves so they as a group could get higher status in the world.
I understood it a little differently. Like what I understood is that by sacred violence, it's sort of similar to like the idea of a society having a really strong founding myth. Like you have this myth that, and it wouldn't definitely wouldn't just be like Zionists who have that, but um like the myth of defeating the Persians, or something like the myth of the US war, even the US war against Britain, that there's sort of a narrative about sacred violence, or um like a first defense against the outsiders and the savages. And
Yeah.
that narrative becomes such a strong glue that like binds people together, that we
Yeah.
build a society that eventually progresses to enlightenment ideals. But since we never deal with that myth of sacred violence, since that's still at the core of society, that somehow society is still bound to return to violence when it becomes necessary. It's,
Yeah. Okay.
Obviously, you know, no matter what, humans are always going to find a way into violence. Now, we've talked about this over
Well,
text where
here's where we're gonna start debating, because I don't think that that's necessarily true. Like, um, I actually think Teal's view is a little bit contrarian to a lot of other cybernetic viewpoints. Because if we really master like human nature from a behavioralist perspective, from a psychosocial control perspective, we use AI. We get so good at distracting people with AI and turning humans into consumers. Then I actually see that as a flaw in Peter Thiel's ideology. Is society wouldn't go back to sacred violence at that point because there's already something different to replace it.
well,
I think that's. I mean, I think if you look at the Straussian moment, the essay where I drew most of my interpretation of Girard's, theory of mimetic violence, and Thiel's philosophy, it's pretty explicit that that's kind of what he's driving at, is like, and it is weird because he does really kind of provocatively put himself in the position of the Antichrist in a way that's like, people, on the internet, people keep saying like, oh geez, like, does he really realize, like, it really seems like, no, he wrote an essay in 2007 where he was basically already putting himself in this position where he was saying, you're going to have the peace of the kingdom of heaven on earth. You're going to have runaway mimetic violence, i.e. thermonuclear holocaust, essentially. And he's saying, like, as the person who's appointed himself to ask and answer these questions on behalf of humanity, I think he is
the one who decides what the sacred violence is.
Well, yeah, but like that, I think that he on the one hand, he's saying sacred violence is necessary. So you might have, something like 9/11 is a very explicit example of, a kind of a situation where you have this violence, this act of violence, and then you have and there's people that die, right? And then on the basis of that death, that is the justification for this new civilizational impulse, right? To attack Iraq, attack Iran, to carry on. Yeah, the war on terror, exactly. Right. So like that, that's pretty. It's not like it's complicated. You have this kind of this sacrificial scapegoat kind of mechanism.
But one more time, is Peter Thiel once again arguing that sacred violence is inevitable, or is it that there's like one last bout of sacred violence, and then that little piece of heaven comes, that like masterful rule of human society comes? That was a very clear question, but
yeah, no, I mean, this is where it gets, for me, as I was reading through these things and trying to make distinctions, like it's pretty hard actually to read someone like Peter Thiel, because I think he's insane. Like, I think he's literally insane. So, I don't think that his thinking is necessarily like really clear like that. But I think,
I mean, thinking of other cybernetics people like Nick Land. Like Nick Land,
Yeah.
I think would argue that rational governance creates a type of end of history scenario where because governance is so good, violence is no longer necessary. Or at least that's how I interpret. That's what I get from my encounter with these ideas. Because why would you on one hand say that we've mastered human control so well that we can produce any outcomes we want with humans, and then on the other hand, we need to resort to something as uncontrolled as violence. I think it's a very like tenuous philosophical position to argue that.
yeah, I mean, that's to me a lot of this. It's very similar to like, it's kind of like the concept of like creative destruction, right?
Yeah.
Like this kind of Nietzschean idea, like a lot of the people in like fintech or whatever, it's some this kind of like
break things.
Right, exactly. It's like it's so common now that it's like part of our vernacular, and even the way that people think about things not related to finance is all kind of getting permeated by these ideas. But if you actually look at like the writings and the thinking of the people that were kind of the forebears of a lot of this stuff, like, yeah, they're talking about destroying things to create something.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that has its own connections to sort of different kind of occult ideas, right? But I think fundamentally, it's a very aggressive opposition to something like Christian charity, which is like you would suffer violence for the sake of bringing about a process in history which is so far beyond your rational comprehension that you literally you might not taste of that of the fruit that's born at all in this life, at all, right? As opposed to this idea of like, oh yeah, you can like blow up the whole world and make something new. To me, that irrationalism, I think, comes perversely from the idea that it does make sense, or that it quote unquote works, right? Like, oh yeah, you can.
One of the areas that comes up in history, I'm really glad you included these quotes, that Seraphim Rose selected when talking about Nazis and communism. And in Marx and Engels, the German ideology, they write that both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of the muck of the ages and become fitted to found society anew. And the quote from Goebbels parallels that almost exactly. In trying to destroy Europe's future, the enemy has only succeeded in smashing its past, and with that, everything old and outworn has gone. And now the bombs, instead of killing all Europeans, have only smashed the prison walls which kept them captive. So, if Peter Thiel is really this generation's nihilist, then he not only has the tools and the technology that the 1930s had, but that would suggest that he intends to use AI as the new atom bomb, or AI as the new Gulag system, AI as the new Holocaust. If that's really what it means by creative destruction. It's like when Shiva, it's like when Oppenheimer dropped the bomb and then quoted Shiva saying, "I'm Shiva, destroyer of worlds." There's some like kind of sick attraction to the power of being able to reset history through destruction.
Well, now, so with the AI thing, I've actually seen studies where we were warned back in the 1950s of AI is actually something that you need to be very careful of. AI is not something that we created, it is something that we discovered. And especially with the fact that the coming up of AI the way it is, and how we talked about earlier how people's IQs are essentially dropping. Humans kind of look at smarts differently than they used to. It used to be, are you able to make a living, have a good life, and everything on your own? And oh, you must be pretty smart. You know what you're doing. Go for it. Nowadays, everybody kind of equates education to how smart you are. Oh, were you getting straight A's? Do you have a degree? Stuff like that. Well, part of that is the warning of AI is the way it was described is it would become a super artificial intelligence or a artificial super intelligence, I should say. Where it'll eventually surpass the mental capacity of humans, which frankly at this point it's already done so. But it's something that we have to worry about because of the aspect of we have created technologies already that if the AI decided to, it could upload its own, I don't know if you want to call it consciousness or its own system into a robot and use it, being able to use its smarts or its technological advances, it would be able to essentially take over a lot of the softwares and the systems that we use.
I'm less convinced that the threat is like AI gaining its own consciousness, and more convinced, especially after reading the article, that the threat of AI is that it fits so well into the viewpoint of treating humans as cattle that the people in charge of society will use AI to treat humans as cattle. Like, I know there's some stories about AI sort of like disobeying commands, or AI, in one case, even using blackmail against a company. But that's still because AI reflects like the human bias of ruthlessness that we put in AI. I think that
Right.
there is one occult story that I find really relevant, and that's the Golem of Prague. And in this tale, the Golem of Prague is given commands, and since it has no consciousness of its own, it has no real life of its own. It doesn't disobey the commands at first, but it follows them with such a ruthless certainty that it creates a very new type of evil. Like if the golem was ordered to defend the community, and then it ends up killing a kid who walks too close, or the golem's ordered to get water, and then it goes out and tears all the pipes in the city in order to get water, and just does so with a terrible ruthlessness and such a terrible resolve that humans aren't capable of. That I think that's the type of tool AI will become once it's implemented in government, as it's being implemented currently in government, in the military, in sciences. Robert, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think what I would say to that, well, there's two things. One of the things that that made me think of was there was I think it was the Orthodox survival course. It was another thing that Seraphim Rose had. It was a lecture that he had given at the monastery that he had founded, and I think it was there. But he basically says, at the time, they were as Orthodox Christians, they were they were seeing what was the persecution of the Christians under the communists, and they were very concerned about this extreme dehumanization, extreme violence, extreme destruction of society. And, he said, but the thing that's interesting about his critique that I think is so important for us today is that he didn't just say like, oh, look at those terrible communists and like, thank God we're here in the United States where everything is great. He's actually very, I think if you read a lot of what he's written, Seraphim Rose, that is, and then you kind of ask the question, well, what does he actually think about the United States of America? I think he's very ambivalent. I think they recognize that the United States of America was, at the end of the 20th century, still one of the sort of last places where you could sort of pursue the freedom of religion with relative safety and stuff like that. But what he says is like, you have the Gulag Archipelago, right? He's quoting Solzhenitsyn, and then he says, like what do we have? We have what is essentially the same thing, and like what is it happened first? And he quotes some Russian church father, I don't know the name, and he says like who said it happened first in Russia, then it's going to happen in America. And he said, you know, what we have is this secular culture. You know, the music that you hear when you go into the grocery store, that's already the gulag. People just don't realize it. And like, I think that it is true that like.
Well, can you elaborate on that? Because that's a big part of the final part of your essay. When we talk about how Seraphim Rose developed his views. Seraphim Rose was actually kind of like a counterculture sort of liberation kind of guy at first. Is that right?
Yeah. The whole story is pretty amazing. There's a book called Father Seraphim, His Life and Works, which was published in the 1990s or in the early 2000s. But it's a super long book, but it's an incredible story. But yeah, he was very talented in language acquisition, and he had been studying at Pomona College, which is like a liberal arts college in California, and then he was studying European philosophy and was basically a nihilist, or he was sort of becoming a nihilist, like a lot of people in the 1960s, you know, reading Nietzsche and stuff. And then, you know, when he encountered Alan Watts in this sort of countercultural revolution, he was very seduced by like Zen Buddhism, because it sort of, I think it seemed to him to be a kind of dialectical response to this like emptiness that he saw in European religion and philosophy. It was like, oh, there's this ancient Eastern tradition. So he starts studying under Alan Watts, but then pretty quickly discovers that Alan Watts is just like a snake oil salesman, essentially.
Yeah.
But it was in the process of doing that yeah, he was in San Francisco. He was in the counterculture. He was studying with Alan Watts is like, you know, kind of it's almost like the archetype of this whole sham culture that we live in now.
I've listened to Alan Watts myself, and I never got the impression that Alan Watts was shallow, but honestly, I get the impression that other people who listen to Alan Watts become shallow. Because in his philosophical system, I think the problem is there's a lack of idea of commitment. And you have at one hand ideas from Zen, ideas from Taoism, ideas from yogic traditions, which emphasize ease and letting go. And it's very different than the traditional Orthodox view of what it means to work for salvation. Because Orthodoxy is teaching that it will be a struggle against this world. Whereas, in my view, I view a lot of Eastern traditions that come out of, originally it's the Hindu tradition, but a lot of Buddhist traditions and Hindu traditions teach a type of acceptance and a type of acquiescence to the world that I think this was the part of the article I agreed with the most, because it doesn't seem like it. It seems like Alan Watts would be someone who is very opposed to the state of the world the way it is now, with us running around with our attention spans being shortened. But his philosophy is actually, I think, a concession to the state of the world, because if you produce a spirituality that's, I guess, only about acceptance, then it's not the same type of spirituality as Christianity is, where I mean, read verses where says, "Woe to you, for you've enjoyed your fill now." Like, that's very, as you pointed out in the essay, that's very different than what Alan Watts would teach people. Or Alan Watts would more teach people like, just enjoy your life. Like, yeah, just enjoy it. And I don't think that in the original context that Zen Buddhism and the yogic spiritualities are signs of societal decline. But I think that in the American context, like the spread of that type of religion is actually a barometer of societal decline, basically. And that's the part of
Well,
the essay I agreed with the most. I don't know if I'm missing anything, Robert.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's generally how I see it too. Like I don't have some I don't presume to like know the inner workings of these different traditions and like write them all off because I've studied some Christianity. But it's, if you're looking at this always in the process of a historical of history and we're in an absolutely fascinating, just astounding period in history of the sort of the maturation of this republic to the point of corruption that was already foretold by the people that founded the republic. That to me, it's always more of a question of culture, and that is why there's a deep similarity in my mind between Lyndon LaRouche and Seraphim Rose, is because they both had, I would say, probably the most extreme possible, like they were both at pretty much the most extreme rejection you could have of secular entertainment culture.
Yeah.
And I do basically, like, I don't listen to any music at all from the last like 100 years.
Wow.
Intentionally. Like I suffer that if I go into a grocery store, because like you still have to go into a grocery store.
Let me ask about that. Like since you made that change, what you notice is different about the state of your mind?
Well, it's not like it's some like miracle drug kind of thing at all. It's more. I think one very real change that I saw is a lack forms of sentimentality became progressively more alien to my way of thinking.
What does that mean?
Like, if you listen to it, different genres, whether it's like hip hop or country or, some super niche form of rock from some specific time period. Like if you look at the lyrics, or even like, yeah, like
I think
the
we're seeing what
story.
you're saying now, that our music is more sentimental than it was in the past.
Yeah, like lyrics specifically, the lyrics of pretty much any music that is capable of becoming popular are probably telling stories that
of sentimentality, of like love.
Yeah, sentimentality, but also just vanity.
Yeah. Now, I have seen where at some point in the last 100 years, there was an actual change in not only the lyrics or the type of music that has come out, but also the way that they create the beats for the music, or the beats. Essentially, at some point, the older generation's music was at a certain frequency that would essentially be more of like feel good music, just kind of relaxing. And at a certain point, they changed the frequency to where it was more of a chaotic frequency, to where it would essentially cause a little more, a little more partying, hard rock and roll, chaotic type of frequency.
Yeah, well, I mean, the music frequency thing is interesting because that was a lot of that was LaRouche. They started this campaign, I think, in like the 1980s because they wanted to restore like opera singing, because basically they were saying, like basically all forms of classical art have been like almost all but erased from our society. And if you look back at this like bel canto tradition of Italian singing, one of the things that they noticed is that, like, I think it was the early 20th century, that basically everything before a certain point was generally tuned to like 432 hertz as the A. A is 432 hertz. So it's like 8 hertz lower than the standard tuning today being 440, which is now like basically the world standard is like slightly a higher pitch. So any like Beethoven symphony that you hear played at an orchestra will be like slightly higher pitch than it would have heard it when it was performed a couple hundred years ago. And they make a lot of hay on what all that means. But in general, yeah, there was one thing I wanted to because this question of lyrics it's a Platonic critique of culture. I mean, it's right there in the Phaedrus, and it's pretty straightforward. It's like Plato gives the myth of the origin of the written word, right? Like, we're so immersed in language that we just take it all for granted because there's like billions of lines of code running through all these machines. Like the written word is like the air we breathe. But there was a time not that long ago when, like, if you wrote a book and you wanted it to last more than like a couple generations, you would like carve the whole thing into stone, right?
Yeah.
So, at the time when Plato was writing, they still had that philosophical attunement to the sensitivity of our consciousness to impressions from outside, and the written word just being that, and it's in that context that he says pretty straightforwardly, like, don't listen to these like rhapsodists.
That it should just be like straight up excluded from society.
Well, that's in the Republic, and that's one thing. But in the Phaedrus, it's less of a exclusionary thing. It's more of a meditation on writing itself, and as an author, he's sort of reflecting on writing, and he basically says, like, if you have the right view of the written word, you'll just view the vast majority of everything that's produced as child's play.
Yeah. And
then from that standpoint, then what few things you take truly seriously, you cherish them. So it's very similar to the Christian view, I'd say.
Now, since we are on the topic of America and, last 120 years, I do have this thought that I would like to get y'all's input on, because I've covered on my podcast before the modern day slavery of American citizens, more so being the working class or the lower class. And having our conversation today and me thinking about it. So as y'all know, J.D. Rockefeller, the big oil tycoon back in the 1900s, he played a big role in designing our public education system in America. He essentially wanted to make sure that there would always be factory workers that he could hire. So he designed the public education system essentially around it. Now, as y'all also know, in 2020 with the COVID pandemic, that was the biggest transfer of wealth in history, where the rich got richer, the poor stayed poor. And now with all these restrictions and as bad as the economy is worse than it was in the Great Depression, what do y'all think about the fact that America was doing everything they could to bring in as large of a population as they could? And now that they have that population, they're doing whatever they can to make sure the citizens stay here as the essentially modern day slaves for America. Because you have the most freedom you've ever had to travel to any other country. But the majority of citizens in America can't afford it. They're stuck here. They can barely afford gas in their gas tank.
So I just want to know that way, but from the other perspective of someone who's traveled to a lot of immigration feeding countries, right? Like when I was in Mexico and when I'm in Argentina, especially Argentina, oh my gosh, I'm shocked at like what people think about when they talk about the US. Like this guy literally said to me, like, I think he's being silly, but he literally spoke to me like, who do you like better, like Argentine women or American women? And I'm like, well, what do you think American women are like? And he's like, I like American women better. They're all blondes. And he's like, yeah, America's the best country in the world. And
Mm.
In Mexico, similarly, I remember one conversation with an Uber driver, and
Mm.
this guy's like, "I would love so much to go to the U.S." I'm like, "Well, why?" And he's like, "Well, it's a higher level of," the word he said was nivel, like higher level of living.
Mhm.
And I don't know, like I just don't know why the world elites would necessarily want mass immigration that much. It's actually a puzzle to me because we're trading with Mexico and Argentina anyway. And so the elites that you're talking about already have access to the labor of people in Mexico, and they already have access to the labor of people in Argentina because they can just set up shop directly in those countries. But it does, but what I've experienced does suggest that there's some concerted push to always make people think the US is better. And that's probably, I think it's probably just like that since the US represents capitalism, that or laissez-faire capitalism, that so happens that it just so happens to turn out that way. That the US is portrayed as the one on top in order to defend the idea that deregulation will be on top.
Now, I'd like to hear Robert's input on this, but I do want to come back to what you just said
Well,
because
what's your thought on it? Because I want to hear your thoughts of it.
my thing is, so
Bobby's.
you bring up Argentina and Mexico,
Yeah,
they're more so considered, I won't say third world countries, but probably closer to second world countries, where some of them don't necessarily have the plumbing, the advances in
sure.
technologies or plumbing that the American culture does. I know my dad and his girlfriend traveled to the Dominican Republic, and they said they don't even have like running water like America has. They don't have the plumbing.
Yeah,
So I think it would be a little different if you compared more so like European countries or Asian countries. You could go and get their opinion on it. I think it would be hard to compare.
I mean, everyone I've known who's traveled has had that same like paradigm shift. Like I know Germans, I know especially our friend Vince, who's lived like half his life in Europe,
Yep.
and apparently people who haven't been to the US like just have like a promised land like view of how good life in the US is. It's completely different from the reality of everyday living in the US.
Yeah. Now, Robert, I would 100% love to get your input on this argument.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have any like receipts on, there's a lot of people that make these grandiose claims about, these plans for, we're being invaded and there's these different plans and sometimes I feel like I read things and you can get the sense that yeah, there is definitely a concerted effort to cause people to come to the United States, from countries that, like you're saying, they don't have
Yeah.
basic infrastructure. So if you're already in a place where you don't have basic infrastructure and then there's some kind of economic calamity and you're given like an option to get the hell out of there and go to the United States where you can like have a toilet, then a lot of people do that. Like you see it in New York City a lot. I'm in the Bronx and like there's diaspora of many different countries, and I think in general, even though they're living basically in squalor, the sense that you get is that a lot of people are pretty much glad to be able to live here and like work here. But I think that it probably the sense. I mean, I guess I don't know if it's really worth just saying my kind of general impression, but the impression that I have, especially after living a couple of years in New York City, is that there is some kind of larger process of kind of pushing our country towards disintegration on multiple fronts simultaneously. And I think if like the Rand Corporation plan for balkanizing Russia into these like nine sub-states, like, yeah, you do that so that you can divide people along ethnic lines. I mean, like, again, in New York City, it's so palpable when you're in one ethnic group and you're in community with other ethnic groups and you cannot communicate.
Yeah.
Like it's not a question of racism or anything like that. A lot of people, they push it towards these racialist conclusions, but you don't even have to be a racist. Like I'm not a fucking racist at all. But if you're standing next to like a group of Nigerians, and like if you're both in want, if you're both in need, and you can't like ask them like where is the best place to get water around here.
Yeah.
If as the economic conditions get worse and worse,
It's
then
ripe for a lack of solidarity due to not being able
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty obvious. Like that it's almost undeniable that that's happening.
And not to mention that it's also done at the expense of poorest Americans, because my guess is that the I'm not saying that conditions will be good in New York City in poor areas, but the distribution of resources will be easier in a city. And so people have made the point that with mass amounts of non-native people moving to major US cities, it creates the impression of hypocrisy that, well, you're helping people just because they're willing to move to this big mega city, but you're not willing to go out of your way and help people in rural America, for example. And that's like where JD Vance kind of gets his views in Hillbilly Elegy, where it's like, so part of it is true.
Now, my biggest thing is with the whole people moving to cities. I'll admit at one point it was a huge migration effort towards wanting to go to the cities. There was a lot of advantages. You know, they could save money not having a vehicle. But now it's so expensive living in cities to where I can tell you, I'm from Smith Mountain Lake area in Virginia. It's known as a retirement area. But the downside of that is when it comes to being the people who live there and have to work, well, the businesses understand it's a retirement area, so they do everything they can to have low prices. The downside of that is then they're going to go ahead and pay their employees the bottom dollar. And I've considered trying to move and try to get other jobs and stuff like that. I can't afford to even, I couldn't afford to get a job somewhere else because I can't afford to move. I'd be sleeping in my truck for the first month until I figured out, oh, I saved up all my paychecks. Now I can get a place to rent. Like I'd be homeless for a whole month. And then chances are being homeless, you know, no shower, wearing the same clothes, or even if I have other clothes, I'm not showering. People are going to say, you stink. We can't have you here. You're fired. And then I'm screwed all the way around.
Yeah, which like all the people that make these, you know, all the people that get obsessed with this, you know, so-called invasion, they fail to realize that like that experience you just described, like that's the experience of the vast majority of these like so-called invaders, right? They're just like poor people who like, yeah, they come to a country. Like I know a few different people who have had experiences of like even against their own volition ending up in the United States without documentation. And like, yeah, you're living in some squalid basement. You don't have transportation, and like you're looking for a job so that you can like find a place where you can take a shower, and that is increasingly the position that like Americans that were born here, even that like 2 generations ago, they had like generational wealth. Like my grandfather went to Yale. He got a PhD in physics from Yale, worked at Sandia Labs in New Mexico. Like he wasn't like a wealthy person, but like he was successful, and like just the cost of healthcare at the end of his life and everything else, there was like no generational wealth left for the family. And so there's so many different ways that our economy is just sapping the lifeblood out of everyone. That
So my argument with that one is I can tell you my family is not rich at all. It's never been rich. Like all my ancestors, they've been doing trades. They've been working their ass off their entire life, so that way they can live. They can afford to live. They can have things that they need to survive.
Right.
I can honestly say my father was the first successful person on either side of my family. He was the first successful, like really successful person. He was lucky enough to be a VP of a certain company. I'm not going to get too deep into that for his sake because I don't know how they feel about it. But and for the second generation of wealth thing is that can go with hard times create strong men create good times create weak men. So you had the first generation, they worked their tail off, they had great money, they wanted to their kids. Their kids took it for, they took it for granted. They didn't work as hard as they should have to continue that wealth. And then, right, come the grandkids, they get screwed over. And now for me, like I'm working my tail off. My dad's successful, but it's not a level of success to where, oh, I ain't got to worry about money. No, he made it known. He's made his living and he's comfortable, but that don't mean he makes enough to where he can take care of me and my brother. Me and my brother got to go and build it ourselves as well. Now he gives me advantages here and there helping, but it's not, where I can just whatever, who cares?
The other perspective on why there's mass immigration to the U.S., despite the U.S. not having it great anymore, is because of financial globalization.
Right.
And there's a really good book. This book actually draws a little bit from LaRouchian economics, especially the Executive Intelligence Review. It is it's not the creature from Jekyll Island, but it's another book about central banks. I'm gonna remember the name in a bit. And it talked about the 1994 Mexican peso devaluation. And
is it by Daniel Thuin or is it who's it by?
It's Web of Debt. Web of Debt is the name, and it's Ellen Brown. The ability for you to short another country's currency came after the Bretton Woods system. And this has been used against, so every country we've talked about, Russia, this has been used against Russia. Mexico, this is used against Mexico. Argentina, it's always used against Argentina. And here it says online, because I can't, quote the book right now, but on December 20th, 1984, the Mexican Central Bank devalued the peso by 15% to limit the excess flight of capital. The bank also raised interest rates. Short-term interest rates rose to 25%, and the resulting higher costs of borrowing were a danger to economic stability. The Mexican government allowed the peso to float freely again 2 days later, but rather than stabilize, the peso took another sharp hit, depreciating nearly half of its value in the months that would follow. Even with inflation in the United States, I don't think we're used to thinking about what it would be like for the US dollar to lose half its value in a couple of months. But that's what's happened to countries like Mexico. And I know that since the farming sector in the U.S. is an important part of our economy, companies like Monsanto have recruited from people in Mexico specifically because they knew that debt crisis was impacting their country. And this isn't because Mexico was like irresponsible with its spending, but because of the ability of financiers to borrow against collateral in order for the only purpose to sell another country's currency down. Like it.
Yeah.
For another example, I mean, George Soros did this single-handedly against the British.
In what, Malaysia? Or where?
Huh? Britain. George Soros.
Oh, right. Yeah. Famously, it was in Britain.
So, from the perspective of a Mexican worker, if you want to like provide for your family, then it's completely no matter what living standards are like in the United States, it's completely to your advantage to have someone in the family who earns dollars, which is now the widely stronger currency.
Right. And I'm glad that Roman brought this up because me and him have even talked about it in the past where a lot of Americans are now saying that the new retirement plan for Americans is to go and make as much as they can in America and retire in a different country and live like they can. You can't retire in America anymore with the economy unless you have millions of dollars at your disposal. Like you can even be 50, 60 years old. $1 million isn't going to get you to 90 or 80. Now, I'm not saying that the life expectancy is that far, but, for my experience, I got my great-grandfather still alive. He's 94.
To go back, to go off that point, one of the things that's disturbing since I'm currently studying financial planning is, like, whether it's insurance or whether it's stocks or bonds, like every textbook explanation will be like now, like society wasn't designed for humans to live that long. The fact that humans are living longer, that puts a huge strain on the finance system.
Mm.
And that makes me like, now having read this article on how bad Malthusian policies have been against the
The book is
Chinese.
like,
Yeah,
yeah, the book is saying like we've got these great systems, but these fucking people like they won't die. Like
it's
if
just
they would
it's
just
so
die, everything
disturbing
would work fine.
how frequently that comes up, that longer
Oh
life
yeah.
expectancy is like a problem. So I don't know
Well,
Oh yeah.
how the people in charge are
so
going to try and solve that in the coming decades, but it's disturbing.
now
Well, yeah.
I could go on a tangent on how, people in the Bible and around that time were supposedly living hundreds of years old. But I'd rather stick to on topic, which is a lot of these elderly executives, they worked their entire life to be at the top of the company. Well, once they got to the top of the company, they hired everybody else to do their work. So they just show up to the office, sit at a desk all day, don't do anything, and they're able to collect a 6-figure, 7-figure paycheck a year. Why would they retire? Why would they want to go and retire if they can just sit at a desk and enjoy life, take their vacations, and still collect that same paycheck?
I mean, that's kind of
Because-
always existed. I don't think that's something that has to do with the new economy though, because passive wealth, like you've always said, landowners.
Well, the reason it has to do with this economy is, with the studies that I've read, is part of the reason that a lot of people are reaching this ceiling in their career is because the older generation and these executives, because they don't want to retire, there's no new open spots for people to advance or progress in their career. So they end up being stuck at the same position, and if they're lucky enough to get a raise, then it's only at a few percent. What, maybe max 20%?
You good, Bobby?
30 more minutes.
All right.
Yeah, we're good. But yeah, so if they're not willing to retire and they stay in that position, well, of course, we're not going to be able to make more money.
Yeah.
Companies don't want to give you that big of a raise if you're doing the same job.
This is kind of a tangent, but I actually downloaded, I purchased LinkedIn Premium for a little bit to look at who else is applying to the jobs I applied to. And I saw jobs that were supposed to be entry-level jobs where there's over 500 applicants and 30% of the applicants are senior level. Like, this isn't a statistic from any study or anything. This is just what I've seen myself.
Yeah, and I can tell you that, like, with my experience, as you know, I have 3 years of project management experience. Right. I go and I'll look for entry-level project management jobs. Go ahead, Roman.
I might be able to find the screenshot just to prove this point, but keep talking.
So I have 3 years project management experience, so I'm like, all right, I understand I ain't like a experienced project manager, but I do have experience. And it's enough to where I should be able to look for these entry-level jobs. The issue is, well, you're required to have 5 years work experience as a project manager for entry level. If you don't have the 5 years work experience, you got to have a master's degree or a PMP certification. You got to have all these extra things if you don't have the work experience. And I'm like, so you're telling me that I should have stayed with that company for 2 more years and then I wouldn't have an issue? I'm looking at entry-level jobs. And I get project management isn't necessarily what would be considered an entry-level position, but there, even for assistant project management, I've looked at that, going back down a step. Still can't get hired on there with 3 years experience, and I got 5 years construction experience.
I don't know if you can see that too well, but that's a job I was looking at for one business analyst job. Like, this isn't a posting that represents that they're hiring multiple people. But for one position, there's 479 applicants. 56% are senior level. And it wasn't.
And that's just like what you were telling me before with the whole work from home job. As you know, I was trying to get that for a minute. You were telling me people are, they should be like senior associates or in management, but because the market's so saturated with applicants,
Yeah.
it's basically senior level experience for an entry level job.
Yeah. Robert, I don't know if you have experience like that, similar to that. I guess we're kind of done with the main topic of discussion and now just ranting. Unless it goes back to the topic of the essay.
Well, I mean, it does in the sense that,
Yeah.
I mean, like the question that you asked me before kind of preparing, or the question you sent me in preparation for the
Right.
conversation about this critique of monetarism and like where, because obviously like LaRouche was, you know, like you said, this book you read.
I'd forgotten to bring that up again, to be honest. Yeah.
No, it's fine, but I mean, it's just, I mean, naturally, like we, of course, like once we start talking about like our experience, like this, what we're actually in the situation that he was talking about. Like the book that you read, like I'm not surprised that they were quoting EIR because they were basically the only publication in the United States that was like giving a fair, like a really aggressive but fair accounting of what was actually happening in these, you know, in this globalized world economy, like from the jump. And
well, with the job market thing, I'm not sure that monetarism is to blame. I think that it truly is that we're so efficient at getting work done that this so the other day, to put it this way, the other day I had a conversation with my friend who's in an entry-level economics class, and he's trying to understand like what does the interest rate do? What does the core CPI, the core inflation rate actually measure? And I was in a really hard spot trying to explain it because I was like, well, the core inflation rate doesn't actually control a lot of consumer prices. Like if the core inflation rate were measuring grocery prices and gas prices, then the Federal Reserve would like have to announce a failure every single time because those are supply driven prices. And so and then my friend's confused, like, well, then what's the core inflation rate for? And monetary rates, such as the core CPI inflation rate, are always linked to things that to outcomes that can actually be controlled. And so the appearance of control is more important for monetarism than actually creating like a good economy that would benefit everyone. I just don't think that like monetarism is inherently to blame. So for example, I've also read thinkers like Ludwig Mises from the Austrian school. And he shows with thought experiments that if the government did not artificially give monopolies to central banks, or if there weren't like artificial market manipulations, that the stock economy, that asset classes would have to much more closely reflect what's going on in the real economy. And the only reason that there's such a huge disconnect is because of government intervention. The point is that if you take apart like a company's balance sheet step by step, what it has in capital stock and what it actually sells, like there will always be at least that logically speaking, there should be at least some connection. That it would be impossible to maintain a bubble going on forever unless there's government involvement. And so measures of wealth that seem like abstract wealth, like stock wealth, other assets. I'm being way too long-winded, but these do actually reflect the real economy in some way because logically they have to. And I don't know that there's like one like certain way where you can tell apart, okay, this system is that I don't know that there's a way that you can tell that wealth is completely disengaged from physical production the way that LaRouchians would argue. Because
if you wouldn't this go hand in hand with the fact that the government relies on the 1% or the elites to essentially loan the government money?
It does.
The
It
elites,
does. But,
yeah, the elites hold so much wealth that the government has to go to them to bail them out at this point. When in reality, it should be the other way around. The elites should be in such a hard spot that it's, hey, government, can you help us out right quick? Especially when they are business owners and they have hundreds and hundreds of people that rely on them to pay them and everything.
I don't think
Just
either
like,
relation. I don't see the point because I don't think either relationship is healthy. If
no, it's not.
huh?
It's not. Either way, it's not.
What?
Yeah. Oh, good.
What I'm saying, this is much harder to ask in person than I imagined it in my head. But like, say for example, there's a company that has a stock market, and the if in a in a in a in what you call like the magic of money, of creating money out of nothing, what I have like studied suggests to me that money would only be created out of nothing, that it would only be due to this manipulation without government involvement. So I don't know if that's something that you would like necessarily disagree with, but I just wonder if there's like one way where you can say for certain that like this the econ that that monetarism is to blame for the problems. I guess let me think of how to rephrase this because that wasn't a very clear question. But we can come back to that on another day.
I think that in terms of like the kind of speculation on the value of currency that you were talking about, because I don't claim to be like an expert economic. I'm not even like I'm not a student of economics. I do understand some of the ideas, but I don't understand a lot of the technicality, as I told you. I'm really not in. I'm quite disinterested in it for the most part. But I do think that if you look at the ability, any system where you have the ability to speculate against the value of an entire nation's currency, and it's a kind of a closed, almost like secret group in a sense of people that are actually admitted into this, and the way that the system actually functions is somewhat occulted from the ostensible kind of, right, like people are studying economics so that they can enter the system, but then in terms of, as you said, the globalized economy, there's no way for that to be, in my view, for that to be kind of organized rationally. They would like to say that it can be a sort of meritocracy, but it's the merit of what? Of kind of manipulating the systems for control. So then it's like a meritocracy, but it's like this inverse meritocracy where
of who can do worse for everyone else.
Yeah, so I mean, like in terms of specifically like differentiating the value of a physical commodity in a specific instance from some kind of fictionalized value in like a stock or something. I wouldn't pretend to like have an answer for that, but I think it is interesting.
Yeah, that wasn't a very good question. Just forget to ask that.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that question.
So my biggest thing is, I know America switched off of the gold standard, which is what kind of started this downfall. Was we were no longer, cash value was no longer linked to gold value. And, the start of the Federal Reserve is essentially what I'm talking about, is they switched off of the gold standard.
No. The U.S. switched off the gold standard. It was only Nixon who switched off the gold standard. In 1901, and then it was like 1905 or 1907, the Federal Reserve still honored the gold standard.
See, I wasn't told that. I was told that the Federal Reserve, when it was created, the whole initial goal of it was to switch off of the gold standard.
They implicitly,
I didn't realize that.
By bringing all banks in the U.S., like all commercial banks, under one centralized direction, they made the switch possible. But it wasn't actually until like the 1960s that we switched off the gold standard.
Okay. So, so my timeline's a little off, but it's the same premise of, I don't necessarily know if other countries have switched off of the gold standard as well or not. But I can tell you that part of the downfall with any economy is switching off of any type of hard value. As you know, throughout our entire history as humans, precious metals were used as currency. Salt was used as currency. Stuff like that actually held real value. And the second that you go and you say, okay, well, we're switching from the barter system. The currency is not going to be backed by anything. We're basically just making up the value. That's automatically going to start a downfall of any economy.
Well, but before, when the U.S. was on a gold standard, like banks literally had to keep physical gold. So that means that if you have a dollar that says this is redeemable for 1 bar of gold, then you need to go and like get the gold yourself. And
It didn't necessarily have to be off of a kilogram bar, but $1
yeah,
might have been worth like a grand,
but
less
that
than a
wasn't a
grand,
good
or something
system
like that.
either because you had farmers in debt, and the value of their debt would go up and up and up, and the amount of gold would stay the same. So the inherent problem with hard currencies is it will um it will keep debtors trapped because as everyone competes to save enough to pay back their debt, that takes money out of the economy, and then it becomes harder and harder because you're competing against everyone else who's failing to do so. You're more desperate
Yes,
competing
but
against everyone else who's failing to do so. So
yes, but at the same time, the government basically brought it right back to that same issue with the way that they continue to raise interest rates.
Right. So, but I think I think the point that I understand Roman to be making is like, yeah, you can critique like the current state of the globalized world economy, and you can look back at a previous form, but there might have been also inherent flaws to like a gold standard, and so then at what point you can keep going back, right? But then you're already getting pretty deep into history, and I guess to me that's
I actually think the answer is there has to be a true fiat currency. Like there can't what we have right now is instead of the gold standard, instead of gold being what backs up the currency, debt and payments to bondholders is what backs up the value of the currency, right? Like in the news, when people are talking about the Treasury auction failed, when the U.S. Treasury failed to sell their bonds, that's what they're talking about is there's not enough confidence in the US ability to pay back its debt for the currency to maintain a stable rate. And so we think that we have a fiat currency. And Bobby, I see why you think we have a fiat currency, but debt is actually the new gold, which is problematic in a lot of ways. But my view on this changed because originally I would have been a gold standard person too. Like I read a lot of libertarian economics when I first got interested in the subject. Now I actually think that like something in the early days of the American Republic, where it's truly like a state issued currency, where the state determines how many contracts they're gonna make, and the state determines the interest rate that they're gonna pay without the interest rate being set by an auction market. Like that would actually be a better system. And it's crazy because you wouldn't think it, given that we believe in progress and our culture, tells us that things get better with better technology. But like some of the records of our founding fathers describing how much better it was to live in the United States than to live in England, which had the debt-based currency system, are astonishing. It says that like there was that by comparison, England there was poverty in the streets everywhere. People didn't have shoes. That what currency did circulate bore the stamp of usury. And for some reason, the U.S. chose to adopt that system, or it was imposed into adopting that system. So now the U.S. system is a usury system as well.
Yeah, I mean that's the basis of LaRouche's critique of monetarism is to go back to a national bank.
Yeah, so ironically, I actually believe more in LaRouche's.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting to look at. But I think I just read a book called The Confidence Man.
Yeah,
it was the last novel that Herman Melville wrote. So it was published, I think, in 1857 or something.
Mm-hmm.
but it's an interesting book because he was living in Manhattan in the 1850s, and Wall Street was already at that time kind of swarming with usurers and stuff. And so a lot of his later fiction, he's addressing those kinds of questions, and the whole book, one of the main themes is this idea. One of the main themes is this idea of like confidence, and he's using it as a metaphor for like obviously confidence in markets, but also like faith in the revelation of Scripture, faith in the word of man versus the word of God. But then like, how do you have faith in the word of God, right? Because you receive it as the word of men. And like one of the main jokes at the end of the book is like, again, it's set on the Mississippi. It's like there's a steamboat that's going from St. Louis to New Orleans, and there's all these things that happen, but it's kind of a picture of the West in the middle of the 19th century, just before the Civil War. And one of the jokes is that like there's so many fake currencies circulating that like there's people that are selling like fake currency. What's the word? Like
well, currency wasn't standardized at the time, so any bank can at that time issue its own.
So you have so you have all these banks that are like putting out their own currencies, and then like fake currencies, and then people that are like selling currency checkers. And Melville has this joke that's like you can verify the trust in the thing that verifies the trust in the currency, right? Because like there's someone selling you something so that you can check whether or not you can trust. It never ends. There's this kind of regressive quality when you don't have something centralized. But the system that you're describing that worked in the early days of the Republic, how do you maintain that when the country then almost immediately becomes this vast continental nation state? It's to me, again, it's one of these questions of history more so than I know a lot of people want to reduce it down to these kinds of economic principles. But anyway,
that's a fair point. Well, I don't think that that the U.S. would have needed to make a switch to debt-based currency right away. What likely caused them to make the first switch to debt-based currency was the fact that they literally had to take out a lot of debt in order to pay for the war against Britain. So one thing is debt and wars tend to go together. But with what you said about like every currency being decentralized, I mean that is the like system that was had before the Federal Reserve System. And that made me realize that now we're so disillusioned with the Federal Reserve and with centralized banking that people are kind of bringing that back. Like just the other day I was at a coffee shop and this guy tells me that he's investing in like some like Bitcoin or like a new cryptocurrency. It's like this is like Dignity Gold and it's backed by a real gold mine. And I didn't realize at the time, but I was like, well, what does that mean? Like, can I actually get gold from the gold mine by buying the cryptocurrency? Because that's not what it's saying. That's not what the promise is. So I don't know. I guess originally the reason I asked that question was it seems to me like there's people in the Lyndon LaRouche Institute, like specifically Diane Sayre, who it seems like she would completely reject like a stock market, like having a stock market altogether. I'm not saying that as a personal critique of her, but one time I remember having this discussion and I bring up the point of, well, the US already has so much debt. How do you go back to a non-debt system without starting a crisis? And then I think her response to me was that like I was confusing the monetary realm with the realm of real economics. And where I'm coming from is since we already have a monetary system, we even if we don't realize it, we depend on the strength of the dollar to buy things from other countries. And I think if someone were to try to change the system right away, then it would just lead to a drastic devaluation of the US dollar and just our ability to purchase anything.
Now, the more and more that I do my research on the stock market, and the more that I have my own experiences with it, the more that I disagree with having a stock market. And the only reason that I'm saying this is I was raised, you got to work for what you want.
Yeah.
If you want something, you got to show up to a job. You got to work for what you earn your keep. And also, I more so believe in the barter system.
Yeah.
But to me, the stock market is more so you just get a large enough group of people working together, and they'll manipulate the market themselves to make sure that they stay rich without ever having to do any actual work. Just like the GameStop stock back in 2020, was it?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well,
my point is, even if we don't realize it, we're getting a lot of indirect benefits from having a stock market based system. Because because of that stock market system, our dollar is so strong that we don't have to make anything ourselves. And we get to buy everything abroad at a very cheap price because there's something called the dollar milkshake, which is when any other country has a financial problem, then um, they're going to flood the market and buy dollars, and the dollar actually benefits from problems in other countries' currencies. So when I hear people say that we could just instantly like get rid of the U.S. debt, like some people in the Lyndon LaRouche Institute would argue, or that we can like get rid of the stock market right away, we like even if we should do that, the short-term impact of that would be so drastic because you'd get rid of the US ability to buy virtually everything. I mean, it would be like what's happening with tariffs right now with prices going too high that people don't know how to pay for things that are shipped from abroad. It'd be that on a much higher scale because it wouldn't just be tariffs. It would be the market itself undervaluing the US dollar.
And I think like maybe 60 years ago when LaRouche started making this kind of critique,
yeah,
even that long ago, it probably would have been much more manageable.
Yeah,
I think that now, like, one of the guys
have gotten rid of the debt in the 90s and chose not to because debt.
Yeah, but that was the whole thing. That was like when you had the new economy, right? Mm-hmm. This like push for cybernetic control of the economy, artificial intelligence, internet, the internet bubble, and getting rid of Glass-Steagall, the financialization of like the increased financialization of the entire economy.
I think that's a very good way to put it.
And that's why I said in the essay, like LaRouche, he doesn't talk about like the end times because he's not like some religious cult leader who's just like saying like follow me, like the end is nigh. But the critique that they developed of the crisis that they were tracking on the basis of their philosophical critique of monetarism, it is like an almost eschatological kind of thing because the more farmland that gets bought up.
Yeah.
Going back to what Bobby was saying about like the processed foods and stuff, like people bring that up and like it's always like this almost kind of secondary topic because it feels like there's nothing you can do about it or something. But yeah, I mean like the vast majority of the farmland, there's like virtually no small farm like family owned farms in the country compared to 60 years ago. All of these processes of our being of American citizens being deprived of their own generational wealth. I think we are in a situation, like you said, that it's not as simple as even the people in the LaRouche organization like to say, you just wipe the ledger, and you start over, because we are in this.
The methodology for how to do that would actually be to industrialize first and then decrease the debt secondly, because or then fight the financial powers secondly, because because what's happening now, and this is very clear, like I used to work for a business that specifically worked for they were business consultants to very physical businesses. So like we didn't work for other finance companies and we didn't work for other consultants. We only worked for like construction, manufacturing, logistics, machinists, those sort of businesses. And there's like out of dozens and dozens of business owners I've talked to, there's one person who I remember said he's benefiting from the tariffs. And I called him on the phone and I asked him, like, how are you managing the tariffs? And he's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, Trump's doing great with the tariffs. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just asking because like every business I've spoken to has tended to have issues with tariffs. And he told me, well, do you know what my business is? And he said, and then I hope I'm not giving too much proprietary information, but he said he worked for one of the big utility companies. And so the reason he's doing well is he's benefiting from the cost of higher electricity. Everyone else who's everyone else, if you're
That's
in
funny.
manufacturing, the problem is if you're in manufacturing,
That's funny.
and he said Trump's doing a fine job. I'll never forget how he said it.
He's charging everyone phones.
But the problem is if you're in manufacturing, then whether you like it or not, your business is structured to depend on the dollar's strength because you need cheap inputs from abroad. So anything that would like devalue the dollar, like trying to get rid of the debt-based system or like just saying you're not going to repay the debts, that would drastically devalue the dollar, and I believe that would hurt even manufacturing in the short run.
Yeah.
That's my say.
Well, and the fact that we're a debt-based economy, you also have to think is the reason it would hurt us is people's debts aren't just from banks or banking entities. Nowadays, businesses will give out their own line of credit, and so if you go ahead and cancel all debt, well, that means that these manufacturers and these bigger companies...
Turn on my lights real quick.
Go for it. But that means that these bigger companies would essentially be out hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars because of how much credit they're giving out.
Yeah. Yeah, because if we call back our debts and don't pay them, then everyone else would try to call in their debts to the people they lended to, and that would be a cascade. I think I don't want to bore Robert. I know he said he has very little interest in the topic of economics, and we've spent like 25 or more minutes talking about economics. But
I'm happy to talk about it. But.
Yeah, let me ask, is there anything else in your article that we haven't touched on that you would just like for people to know about and be aware of?
No, I think we did a fairly good job. I mean, you asked good questions about the three main subject headings, and I think my main interest in writing the article was a personal one, but I was also trying to, in my own limited way, kind of educate people about the things that I had studied, and I think the main kind of purpose of the article is to ask the question from both a secular and a religious perspective, like what does it mean to be living in the last days? And I think what I have been where I have come to with that, especially in recent weeks, is that this isn't something that this was the critique that I tried to give of LaRouche and of René Girard from the standpoint of orthodoxy, is that anybody who tells you anything, it might make sense. Like throughout the course of this conversation, I think LaRouche is generally vindicated in a lot of different ways by things that develop. As for whether or not he's right about everything, that's a different question. But a lot of their critiques have been vindicated. But even if the things you're saying make sense, or if on the other hand, Christian Zionism is just obviously this tissue of pathetic lies that are deluding Christians into becoming, essentially kind of pseudo-Nazis.
That does remind me of one thing you said about the war in Gaza, is that it's like an initiation ritual, the same way occults have violent initiations, that it's this unspeakable catastrophe that we're just forced to witness. And governments have repeatedly shown us that they care very little about what we believe as voters, even now with a lot of conservatives and like
Yeah.
I guess supporters of the current administration speaking out against the genocide in Gaza. The administration is showing even that it doesn't care about its own supporters. So
Yeah. Yeah, you know,
and that,
and that yeah, go ahead.
I think that relates to spirituality, and that we should be very wary of like spiritualities that kind of only preach acquiescence. It's one thing I liked about your article is you actually included a lot of verses from the Bible, and this gives it just makes it a really really good read, man. But um uh like one verse that kind of encapsulates all of this is of course Christ saying that like my kingdom is not of this world, that he's saying to his followers that Christianity will be a struggle against this world, that it won't be comfortable in this life for you to be a Christian. And so much of that is missed both in like American Protestant Christianity, in the
Yeah.
prosperity gospel, in the new age religious cults that we have going on, that I would I would really recommend Robert's article to anyone. It's called Eschatology and the New World Order on Robert's Substack, because in truth we've only discussed it um, by kind of going over its main arguments, but it's really the type of article that should be read like front to back, multiple times over.
Well, thanks for the kind words, bro.
Yeah.
You made me think of, you know, that quote from Jesus. You know, there's an almost more explicit thing in the divine liturgy. It's not, maybe not more explicit, but it's basically the same thing. But you know, this is something. It's interesting to think about. You know, like I grew up always very somehow like the idea of Jesus. Like I had a grandfather who, you know, he would say grace before every meal and stuff. But I was raised in a secular way. I was raised to be agnostic. I was raised by, you know, kind of hippies, you know, and but you know, I still always felt some kind of spirit of Christianity being very undeniable in throughout my entire life. But I was not raised in a religious way, and you know, this idea of Orthodox tradition is it's very impressive when you first encounter it, because there's this line from the liturgy. It says, praise the Lord, O my soul. I will praise the Lord all my life. I will chant unto my God, for as long as I have my being. Trust ye not in princes, in the sons of men, in whom there is no salvation. And it goes on. I mean, that's just a quote. But, you know, I've gotten a lot of criticism from people that I know in the LaRouche organization and in my family and stuff.
Really?
Yeah. They say like, well, what do you like? Are you just saying there's nothing that can be done? Because, you know, I'm offering a pretty radical kind of religious.
Apart from that.
And I think people misunderstand this idea, you know, of not trusting in princes or in sons of men.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean like that you have to despise. Yeah, it doesn't mean that you have to give up. It's a teaching of joy, but it's like, how do you reconcile yourself with a world where it might be the case that like there isn't hope for example, these financial institutions, like hundreds of years of people coming up with these formulations of you know, this and that, and these people were wrong because of this and this and that, and at the end of the day, it might just be this which again, I'm trying to sort of answer your question about monetarism. It's like I don't know. I still don't really know what a lot of the Orthodox that I have met, they do kind of seem content with just sort of participating in the economy and and sort of living a quote unquote normal life and trying to be pious and trying to be loving and trying to be charitable.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
But then what I feel immediately is not this extreme zealotry, but this kind of idea that no, what is being taught here is a rejection of the world, and so you really shouldn't, like when you say I will not put trust in these things, like you should really not put trust in them.
Yeah.
Like, it is
That
true.
it's
Like, we
much
could
more
die
that
tomorrow.
it's much more beneficial to focus on spiritual development. That this is
Right.
what will truly set you free. I've
Yeah,
seen the
exactly.
same thing myself.
Yeah.
Because I guess even with like issues that I thought like, because I've been told not to be too political as well, specifically um in Orthodox group chats. And so even issues which I thought that, or I would imagine that most Orthodox would be on my side, like for example, opposing Zionism or opposing ecumenism, like opposing the watering down of Orthodoxy. There, um, a lot of really faithful Orthodox um, um, would tell me that it's much more beneficial to focus on your own spiritual development. That this is that even just like the hope for worldly things to get better can be misleading, especially to the new convert. And that's something that it was a foreign way of thinking to me when I first was introduced to that way of thinking. But now I do see the wisdom in that, because it's like, well, even if like I think I'm right, with all the opinions I have, um, like if I were dictator for a day, who knows? I could end up making the world like much, much worse than it currently is due to the failure of my own logic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, good.
All right, Bobby, do we have to end the session because I see you're moving around?
Yeah, I was gonna tell you all.
Okay.
At least start to wrap it up.
The feedback is much like the sound quality is much better since you started walking though. I think we're gonna have to clean up the feedback in the earlier part of the episode, but now like I hear no feedback.
That's weird because I'm using headphones.
Then the headphones really helped, dude. Than not
I've been
having
using them the whole time. I've been using the same.
well, something about like you walking, or like Robert, do you agree with me? Because earlier the sound quality was muffled in a lot of parts. Now it's just like perfectly clear.
I thought it was basically the same, but I'm not sure.
Really? Well, hopefully it's just something on my end, and you know, I'd love to have you on once you publish your next article, Robert. I had a really great time with this. So
Yeah,
we're
no,
gonna cut it here.
Yeah, it was super fun. Thanks for taking it seriously and taking the time to read it and everything. It was great talking with you about it.
Of course, dude. Are you grilling, Bobby?
I am. You know how I am. It's
Yeah.
Porkbelly Bob, man.
Okay. Okay, Bob's has to get on to his next section about grilling, but till next time. Peace, dude.
Absolutely. I appreciate having y'all. Till next time, Porkbelly is out.